Hello, and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mike Freedman, the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the public broadcasting series The Cowboy Report with journalist Marvin Calve. In the 1962 John Ford film, The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, a local newspaper editor tells a very surprised Jimmy Stewart, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." The National Press Club is indeed the stuff of legends, many of which have the added benefit of being true. April 27th marked the publication of a new book by Gil Klein, highlighting a number of those memorable moments. Gil is director of the University of Oklahoma's Washington Journalism Program, where he is bureau chief of the Gaylord News Washington Bureau. He's also a former president of the club and is considered the foremost expert on what has taken place within the institution's walls over the course of more than a century. The book focuses on moments in which the history of the world, the nation, the city, and journalism intersect through events that have occurred at the National Press Club. Gil Klein has been a member for 35 years, as he notes, nearly a third of the club's history. Highlights of the book include Woodrow Wilson's musings about what he would rather be doing than serving as president of the United States, how Franklin Roosevelt helped save the club and the National Press building during the Great Depression, the story behind the iconic photo of actress Lauren Bacall sitting atop a piano being played by then Vice President Harry Truman, how Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev forced the club to admit women journalists as equals for his appearance, how the club saved a Mexican journalist from being deported to almost certain death, and how it works today to help free Austin Tice, an American journalist being held captive in Syria. We're going to explore those and other stories beginning right now. So Gil Klein, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mike. I certainly appreciate this opportunity to talk to you about this new book. There's so much about the history of the club that just has fascinated me for 35 years. So I'll be glad to launch into it. You tell me how you'd like to proceed.
Well, why don't we begin at the beginning? Tell us about the club's founding and why it was started.
Well, it's back in February of 1908, a cold and blustery day. And there was a reporter by the name of Graham Nickel with the Washington Times, the old Washington Times, and he only had one leg because of an accident, and he had a big Bertha voice, and he wore big Stetson hats, and he loved to play poker. And he was hobbling across 14th Street, right there at F Street, where the building now is, and he ran into his colleague, James Hay. And he said, "I'm sick and tired of having to hunt up a stuffy old boarding house room every time I want to turn a card. Hell's bells, why don't we get us up a press club?" And Hayes said, "How? Where?" And Nichols said, "I don't know, and I don't give a damn, but we're going to have a club." And with that, he hobbled down to the police headquarters, went up to the press room, and started circulating a petition. Anybody wants to put up $10 to start a press club. And oddly enough, by the end of March, they had actually met at the Round Robin Bar across the street from where the club is today, and the hotel there, the Willard, excuse me, and they had the Constitution, and there had been other clubs, and they had all failed for the same reason. They offered credit to reporters to drink. And so the press club was founded on that lofty journalistic principle that you pay for your booze when you drink it, and that's why it's lasted 112 years.
And how did this particular book come together?
Well, Mike, ever since I came to Washington, well, to begin with, I have always been interested in the history of wherever I am. And as I worked my way up to being president of the club in 1994, I made sure I read every single past history of the club, beginning with the great one written in 1928, the 20th anniversary. And there were so many fantastic stories in there. Then the 1948, the 1958 books. And there's so much going on in the club that had so many great stories, and how it was part of the history of everything else that's going on. And then for the 1998, I worked on the history book, and then for the centennial in 2008. I was largely responsible for that book. But all of those are big books about the whole club. I just wanted the tales that shows the fascinating things that happened here without getting too deep into the weeds about how a club is run.
And I understand that this book is a compilation of vignettes that you've actually produced for the club's internal news service.
That's right. Yes, I was encouraged by the History Committee, History and Heritage Committee, to start doing these vignettes. And for almost 2 years, I put out almost weekly stories, up to maybe 1,000 words each. And then those became the basis for this book. So the club is these vignettes all compiled together.
It sounds from what you said like the club has a pretty good archive of,
yes,
of these stories. Talk about the research for the book and how did you select the stories that you did for this one?
Well, there's so many opportunities to get information. The club does have a really professional archives on the 4th floor. And Jeff Schlossberg is the archivist. There's all these old books that are full of the stories. Then there's so much out there. C-SPAN, since 1980, C-SPAN has covered every luncheon at the club, and it's their archives. You can find everything and sit there and watch. I can watch myself age over the years as I watch most of the luncheons until 1991 were audio, and they were filed or stored with the Library of Congress, and the library put together 25 of the best press club luncheons from that time period that were annotated with the events going on at the time. So this was what a treasure trove. I could listen to the actual speech and see what a researcher had dug up about how that speech played into history. It was wonderful.
So I began the program today with the famous quote from the film The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, where the newspaper editor says to Jimmy Stewart, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend."
That's right.
As you researched, as you have written about the club on so many occasions over the years, how do you separate fact from legend? Is that a challenge?
I am pretty sure that everything in there is fact. Now, I've got a lot of these old stories, and somehow I have to say, this is true. And anytime I could check, it was true. I found a couple of places where the dates were wrong. There was one story in there about Warren Harding that was in a book called Drunk Before Noon. And it is one of those things like you're talking about. The legend is so great, I had to print the legend. I have no idea if it's true, about how Warren Harding was playing cards at the press club, which I know that is a fact, that President Harding played cards at the club, and how one of the people in the club wanted him to pardon a boxer who he thought had been unjustly convicted for racial reasons. And Harding allegedly said, okay, I'll pardon him in the morning, just deal. What a great story. Now, he did not pardon. I did do the research and find he did not. This boxer was not pardoned until very, very recently. But it's such a good story. It's in there, and it says in the story, I'm not sure if this is true.
Okay. So let's dive into some of the other stories that are in the book, some of which we mentioned at the top of the program.
Right.
Every president from Theodore Roosevelt through Donald Trump has appeared at the National Press Club, either before, during, or after his term of office.
That's right.
Let's talk about some of the presidents, and let's begin with Woodrow Wilson, who in the book you discuss in terms of his musings about what he would rather be doing than serving as president of the United States. Talk about that.
Well, first of all, Woodrow Wilson was a member of the club long before he was even governor of New Jersey. He was a writer about Congress. He was a researcher about Congress, and he was actually a member of the club. And he would show up at the club. He showed up when he was governor of New Jersey. He once was quoted as saying, "I like to go to the press club. It's the one place I can go to unwind." Now, think about any president recently who would say, "Hey, I think I'll go over to the press club and unwind with the boys." But there was he showed up for the housewarming for the third clubhouse, and he was musing on what he would rather be doing. He would rather be swapping stories with police officers and going around and seeing the monuments and all of this type of thing. And he said something to the effect that everybody thinks I'm just a calculator in my brain, but I'm actually, there's a seething volcano if you only were high enough to see it inside me. And of course, he had this reputation of being this prim Presbyterian. So what happened was that it was off the record, and the reporter says, "Mr. President, can we please run with this?" And he said, "Oh, okay." And it was front page everywhere across the country. Plus, there's this great cartoon done by Clifford Berryman showing things that Woodrow Wilson would rather be doing than being president. That ran on the front of the Washington Star.
Prim Presbyterian, who was also president of Princeton, right?
President of Princeton, that's right.
Yeah. Let's move on to Franklin Roosevelt, who
had
more time in office than any president in history.
That's right.
And you talk about in the book how Franklin Roosevelt helped save the club and the National Press Building during the Great Depression.
Right. Well, as you know, the press club had been constructed, ended in 1927. It was great, happy times, but the Great Depression came in and the rents disintegrated, and the creditors were at the door. They wanted to take over the building. A bunch of reporters, including Bascom Timmons, who was president of the club, were on the campaign train with Roosevelt. And they said, "Oh, boy, we're having so much trouble. Is there anything you can do?" And one of the first pieces of legislation that in the 100 days, the famous 100 days, was new bankruptcy laws that had a little provision in there for clubs. The Bascom Timmons was there when Roosevelt signed it, jumped up and ran down and filed bankruptcy #1 for the National Press Building, which saved it.
And how about the press club during the era of Prohibition, which crossed over Hoover and Roosevelt?
It certainly, and Coolidge, and Harding, oddly enough. Prohibition began in Washington a couple of years earlier than the rest of the country, on November 1st, 1917. There's a great story in the book about how they had a big party that night, and as the hours went by, they put more and more booze on the table at cheaper and cheaper prices. And finally, as the clock struck midnight, everybody could take whatever they could stagger home with. The club officially was dry. Everybody thought, "Oh, the press club, it's a private club, but they'll find a way around this." But they said, no, we're dry. Don't worry, we're dry. And sure enough, there wasn't any booze sold at the bar. But as it says, there's so much booze around the club in every journalist's office, somehow it made it into the club. It wasn't until the club moved to its present location, which was much bigger, that they found a little room up on the 14th floor, about big enough for 10 people. And they dubbed that the Turf Club, and everybody put their stash of booze in there. And so they would sneak up to the floor and hoist a few. And at times there were as many as 30 people packed into that room. But then on the day that it ended, which was April 7th, 1933, This is when it was the beginning of the end of Prohibition. Was near beer was allowed. The press club maneuvered to make sure it had liquor license #1 for the District of Columbia, which it still has. And on the night at midnight, as the truck delivering beer stopped first at the White House, even though Roosevelt was asleep, and then came to the press club and came right up to the bar, and they were hoisted a beer and were very happy.
Where nobody was asleep, right?
You're right.
You mentioned Calvin Coolidge, and he
Yes.
actually played a significant role in the club's history in another way, right?
That's right. The club rented three different clubhouses between its founding in 1908 and 1927. They had a lofty idea that they were going to build their own building. And at the time, all the out-of-town newspaper offices were scattered all over this area known as Newspaper Row. And they thought, if we build our building, we will get all of these newspaper offices to rent the offices, and then our club will be at the top, and all the rents will pay for the club. And which was a great idea. Of course, this was a bunch of journalists trying to do this. And there's goes back and forth of how they tried to get the money. And one of the last steps was they still needed hundreds of thousands of dollars. And the people organizing it says, hey, here's what we do. We're going to have a cornerstone laying, and we're going to invite President Coolidge. And he will lay the cornerstone, which happened. And the Marine Band was there, and Coolidge actually gave an extraordinarily good speech, which you should read this. It's in there, but I won't go into it. But it was a great defense of the First Amendment. And so then the Coolidge leaves, and of course, they're not ready to start construction, so they go hide the cornerstone. But the fact that the President of the United States had given his endorsement of this building, they were able to get the money, including a nice check from the Treasury Secretary, Andy Mellon. So that's how Coolidge did that.
We've been talking about presidents of the United States, and you talked about how presidents like Wilson and others like to come to the club and to be with the members of the press. And so much has changed over the years. What's your view on why the relationship between our presidents and the press has taken such a dramatic turn?
Well, it was an entirely different place. Washington, especially after World War II, and then certainly Nixon, you had kind of what Nixon's relationship with the club says everything about what happened. When he was a senator, when he was vice president, he was at the club all the time. He actually, there's a picture of him playing softball at a club event. He played the piano while Jack Benny played the violin at a club event. You know, then came the 1960 election, and he turned sour. And then he ran for governor of California, as you recall. And when he lost that, he told the reporters, you won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore. And he took a very dim view of the press. And of course, then during his administration, he never showed up. And then they got more and more acrimony between the Republicans, Spiro Agnew, his vice president, calling the press the nattering nabobs of negativism. And it all ended with Watergate, and also the Vietnam War. Even though Lyndon Johnson came to the club quite a bit and gave his farewell address at the club before leaving. But starting, I think, with Nixon, there was this separation. We aren't all chummy anymore, and it was more of an adversarial relationship, and then there's so many other ways for presidents to get their story out that they don't need to come over and come to a luncheon at the club.
For those who are watching and those who are listening, we're speaking with Gil Klein, author of a new book, Tales from the National Press Club. And we're talking right now about the relationship between presidents of the United States and members of the press. Even though there were good relationships for what appears to be a fairly long time from the club's founding in 1908 until the presidency of Richard Nixon and the Watergate crisis for the nation. The relationship between the press and our presidents really has had its share of acrimony from the very beginning, going all the way back to George Washington. Right?
Absolutely. He was the first person who suffered from fake news.
Yeah, and there are those who believe that George Washington actually decided not to run for another term of office because of the press.
That's right. It was terribly maligned back then. It was all partisan. The press was all partisan. This notion of a nonpartisan press didn't come for a long, long time. I should add, though, that even though Nixon was a dividing line, that his successor, Gerald Ford, was the only president who genuinely liked reporters, and he showed up before, during, and for every year afterwards, his administration, he would show up each June and give out an award and give a speech. So it took a while for things to get even worse.
And the contradiction between the president's relationship with the press, sometimes when they were in office and both before and after they took office, might best be illustrated by the life of Thomas Jefferson, who, who I seem to recall at one time said, were it left to me to decide whether we should have government without the press or press without the government, I should choose the latter.
That's right.
But he also said that the only thing you can believe in a newspaper are the advertisements.
Something very close to that. It was the difference between before he was president and when he was president.
Right.
The vitriol in the press at the time of Jefferson was unbelievable, and there are great books on that. But Jefferson had his own newspapers, which he helped finance. Hamilton had his own newspapers that he financed. Poor old John Adams got lost in the middle. Everybody went after him. And the things that they would say in these stories was unbelievable.
Part of what your stories in Tales from the National Press Club chronicle, though, would be that there were rules of privacy for a long time about the president and the first family and what they might do away from the press, and it sounds like even with the press, that never made it into the press.
Yes, not a whole lot of that is in the book because it didn't happen in the club, but that is true. There was, of course, Franklin Roosevelt got away with a lot of stuff with mistresses, and Warren Harding certainly did. He actually was once quoted in the club. He was well known for having fathered an illegitimate child in the White House closet. But he once said at the club, "It's lucky I wasn't born a woman because I can never say no." Yes, certainly there were stories about Kennedy that never got investigated. And his goings on, and there's a lot of stuff about presidential health that never got mentioned. I'm thinking Kennedy had very serious health problems. Certainly, Franklin Roosevelt was on the brink of death when he ran for his fourth term.
Woodrow Wilson too,
and Woodrow Wilson, of course, got away with being totally incapacitated, and the administration pretty much being run by his wife. So yes, there was a lot that was not said.
So here's an iconic story about someone who was fatefully about to become president.
Right.
And the result of this story is perhaps the most iconic photo in the archive of the National Press Club. It is a story about the model and actress Lauren Bacall sitting atop a piano being played by then Vice President Harry Truman. Tell us about that.
Oh, it is the iconic photo of the club. The story there is that during the Second World War, the club and its American Legion post decided to put on canteens for American servicemen who were in the area, and they would get free hot dogs and beer for any servicemen who wanted to come, and politicians could come, but they weren't allowed to speak for more than 2 minutes. This got to be an extraordinarily big event. As many as 700 servicemen would show up. And this was a great opportunity for people to be there at the club. And Lauren Bacall at the time was only 20 years old, but she had just launched one of her great films. And her agent says, I want you to go, Warner Brothers said, we want you to go to the press club. And she didn't want to do it because she was having an affair with Humphrey Bogart, and so they were having a great time. Why would I want to go to Washington? But they talked her into it. So during this thing, Truman was a very great piano player. This was in what we call now the ballroom. There used to be a stage there, and there was a stand-up piano on the stage, and Truman was playing it. And Lauren Bacall's agent saw a good thing when he saw one, and he got her to get up on top of the piano, and she leaned kind of over it and looked down with love in her eyes. And Truman looked up with her with a hubba, hubba, hubba in his eyes. And that became the iconic photo. Now, Truman had told his wife, Bess, that he was going to the press club, and he couldn't get in any trouble because, hey, it was an all-men's club at the time. What could possibly go wrong? And when that photo appeared on the front page of every newspaper in the country, Bess was not amused. And interesting enough, 50 years later, when I was president, Truman's daughter, Margaret Truman, spoke at the club, and I, of course, raised this thing. And, 50 years later, Margaret was not amused. The Truman women had no sense of humor about that picture. But when Lauren Bacall died just a few years ago, I got calls from reporters wanting to know the story. So it was an enduring story.
People who visit the press club today, although they need to be escorted by a member to this location, can visit the Truman Lounge, which is on the 14th floor. And there is the piano, this very same piano.
That's right.
With the photo right above it of Lauren Bacall and then Vice President, soon to be President, Harry Truman.
That's right.
Sitting at the keyboard.
That's right.
It was terrific. Let's switch over to a world leader who came to the press club at a pivotal moment in the history of the Cold War, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, who ended up being a pathfinder for the club itself because he forced the club to admit women journalists as equals for his appearance. Talk about that point of history.
Well, first, of course, I have to go back to the fact that in the original Constitution, it was an all-men's club, which in 1908 would be obvious. There were a lot of professional and social organizations being created at the time that were single-sex. But by 1919, the club there's so many newsmakers happening at the club, but they still refused to allow women to come. So the women, organized by Cora Rigby, the bureau chief of the Christian Science Monitor, created the Women's National Press Club. And they were rival organizations from 1919. And the women were always trying to get equal access to the club so that they could come to all the major newsmakers. Now, so jump right ahead to 1959. Nikita Khrushchev was the first Soviet premier to come to the United States. This was a huge story. But then Nikita Khrushchev says, I'm not coming unless you allow women to come and be in the audience and as equals. And the men said, oh, hubba, hubba, hubba. They got together with the women and says, okay, here's the deal. we will allow 1 point for women for every 10 men in the audience. And we will put your president at the head table. This was groundbreaking. And it happened to be your old friend Helen Thomas, who was the president of the Women's National Press Club that year. And so there, for the first time, women were in the audience, were able to have lunch, were able to send up questions. And unfortunately, when Khrushchev left, whoops, the women were out the door. And they were not allowed in as equals, although at times they could sit in the balcony, but they were not allowed in as full members until 1971.
I'm Mike Freedman, president of the National Press Club, and we are speaking with author Gil Klein, whose newly published book, Tales from the National Press Club, tells of historic moments in the history of the club. Gil, you were talking about Nikita Khrushchev's 1959 appearance and the fact that he forced the club to admit women to be able to see his speech. But it was still a number of years before the club admitted women. And that was a long, slow, and really embarrassing road to accepting women. Tell us about the trajectory and how it finally came to conclusion.
Right. So the women, as I said, had founded the Women's National Press Club in 1919. It became a very vibrant club. They had their own speakers, their own events, but they still wanted to have equal access to the National Press Club because that's where most of these speeches, news-making events happen. So for a while, first of all, they pushed the State Department, they pushed presidents not to speak at the club unless women were allowed, and they didn't get much progress on that. But the men finally said, okay, you can come to these events, but you have to sit in the balcony. And it was hot, you can't ask questions, you can't have lunch. And, you know, that just made them madder. There's a book out, The Girls in the Balcony, about the history of how women got access to into events in Washington. It's not necessarily flattering of the press club. So the women kept pushing. They got Nikita Khrushchev, but they still didn't get equal access. The men said, okay, you can come to the luncheons, but we're going to escort you in and escort you out. You can't hang around. So it took all the way until 1971, which seems extraordinarily late to most people, and it is. But even in that vote, there were some men who said, okay, they can be members of the club, but we don't want them access to the bar and the card room because that's our inner sanctum. And that got voted down and they became full members then. But, and they now, of course, have been many, many presidents, women who have been presidents of the club.
And we're talking about this actually in the year of the centennial of the ratification of the 19th Amendment.
That's right.
The right to vote. And as you mentioned, this fight goes all the way back to women's voting rights. And that anniversary this year. Another anniversary which is coming up, and you've already talked about it, which is a fun story about Harry Truman and Lauren Bacall, in which you discussed the canteens that the press club had. This is the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. And later this year, the press club is going to replicate one of those canteens. And while both Harry Truman and Lauren Bacall are gone, we will commemorate the occasion of the creation of the iconic photo. And we will welcome, as they did during World War II. In that case, it was the GIs who were flowing through Washington on travel to and from the war zones. This year, we're going to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II by welcoming active duty members of the military, along with World War II veterans, and of course, a lot of journalists. So that will be a lot of fun. There's another big anniversary being commemorated this year, and that is the centennial of radio, 100 years. Talk about the club's relationship with radio and television broadcasters versus print journalists.
Of course, the club was founded as a home for print journalism. Obviously, there wasn't any broadcast in 1908. They were very slow, I think, to recognize broadcasters as full journalists. I believe it was because one of their favorite board members wanted to be president, and he just got a job, I think with CBS, that they decided, oh, well, maybe we better let in broadcasters. But broadcast had been a very big part of the club in terms of getting the news out. And it goes all the way back to Lindbergh, Charles Lindbergh's arrival in Washington after his historic flight, and the first coast-to-coast hookup for radio news happened during that day. And of course, if you see all the old photos of the press club events, you see the great big microphones from CBS, NBC. So that broadcast was a big part of it. And the very first speaker, Ramsay MacDonald, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, was the first time there was an actual international hookup. That was in 1933. So his remarks could be heard overseas.
And as we talk about women, as we talk about minorities, as we talk about acceptance of different forms of journalism, such as broadcast journalism, unlike some other institutions, the press club seems perfectly willing to talk about it today and to readily admit that it was behind the times in the acceptance of some of these hugely important constituencies. Certainly, women and minorities more than radio and television broadcasters. But these were elements that were reflective of what was going on in American newsrooms. Isn't that right?
That is true. Certainly, women were having a lot of trouble getting acceptance in American newsrooms, as you may recall Cokie Roberts talking about the early days of her career. You know, you can say there were no blacks in the National Press Club, but there were no African Americans that were hired by standard news organizations to report in Washington. So the first African American to be accepted into the club was a fellow by the name of Louis Lautier. And the problem was that most of the African American press was not daily, it was weekly. And so they could say, well, we only take daily journalists. And but Lautier was a part of the Atlanta Daily World and the National Negro Press Association. So he did qualify for membership. And I don't know whether you want to get into that story, but 1955, again, it was Frank Holman who was the incoming president, and he was approached about, do you think the board would accept an African American? And he polled the board and the membership committee and said, yes, I think they will, and they did. But there was a provision in the Constitution that said if anybody doesn't agree with a member being admitted, they could file a petition opposing it. And sure enough, there was a petition was put up opposing this that had these sufficient signatures. That put things in a really bad situation. And Frank Holman finessed this by saying, okay, we'll have a special election on this instead of fighting it out publicly. And we'll see how this goes. And it was a hugely controversial thing at the club at the time. People for and against. There was politicking like hardly ever went on at the club. But the final vote was 377 for and 281 against. And people were stunned, but that was the end of it. There was nobody. There was one person who quit the club because of it, and that person was not a journalist. And that was the end of it. Now, Lautier didn't show up that much. He was pretty bitter about the whole fight, but it did pave the way for Simeon Booker, who became the editor of Jet magazine, and he became a very big member of the club. He was on the speakers committee. And if you want to talk about it, we can get into how he got Martin Luther King to be the first African-American to speak at the club.
Well, that's a great segue, because what I'd like to engage in with you now is a lightning round of the names of people who have made history at the club. And why don't we start with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
So Simeon Booker was on the speakers committee, and he convinced the committee to invite Martin Luther King. This was 1962. This was a year before the March on Washington and the I Have a Dream speech. Martin Luther King was in jail in Albany, Georgia. He got sprung out of it by a anonymous source that turned out to be the Reverend Billy Graham. So he appeared at the press club saying that for the first time, somebody let an African-American out of jail instead of putting him in jail. But he was talking about the philosophy behind his movement of peaceful protest. And what is interesting about it is, if I listen to it, that many of the themes from the I Have a Dream speech were right there in this 1962 speech, a year ahead of time. In 2013, I believe it was, or 15, the club decided, well, what did he say? We knew he had spoken here, but we didn't really know what he'd said. So I went to the history committee, went to the Library of Congress. They got the speech. We made a transcript of it. And we put on a whole program playing parts of the speech and having experts say what was significant about it. And for that reason, there is a historic plaque put outside the ballroom saying that this was where Martin Luther King spoke in 1962.
Okay, continuing with this lightning round of people who have made history at the National Press Club, let's move to Eleanor Roosevelt.
She was the actual first woman to speak at the National Press Club. And it was 1938, I think, or 39. I should have remembered that. The president said, we should have a woman speak here, and who's the most famous woman in the United States? It's Eleanor Roosevelt. So they went back and forth. I got copies of their correspondence between Eleanor Roosevelt and the president of the press club arranging this to happen. And she was, oddly enough, back then, at the speaker's option, it could be off the record, and she chose to have hers off the record. So we don't know exactly what she said. But we do know that she was asked to speak about this movement there and the New Deal of creating new towns in depressed areas, especially in the coal fields of West Virginia. And there is an Eleanor, West Virginia, which was created at this time. But that, in her column, My Day, she mentioned that she had spoken at the all-male press club, and wasn't that neat?
How about Louis Armstrong?
Louis Armstrong, what a story. In 1971, the President Louvier was being sworn in as president of the club. And as you know, they have a big party. And he was from New Orleans, and he really wanted to have a party to remember. And he got Louis Armstrong to come to perform at his inaugural party. And what is amazing that this Louis Armstrong was really at the end of his career, and he was suffering from ill health, but he really wanted to perform one last time. And he went and he did a terrific performance at the press club. And they had CBS was there with engineers, and they did a recording of it, and they made a record, which was given out to everybody who had attended the inaugural. And it was his last public performance before he died. And it wasn't until just a couple of years ago that Executive Director Bill McCarran and some others have said, can't we reissue this? And through a lot of work there is now, you can listen to the exact same recording that was on that record from 1971.
Terrific. A high moment for you in 1994 during your presidency of the National Press Club was an appearance by Nelson Mandela.
That's right. Well, that was the culmination of a lot of work at the club towards the ending of apartheid. And here, this was the first time that Nelson Mandela came to the United States as president of South Africa. This was a huge deal. So I was extraordinarily lucky to have him speak. What was struck me about him is his inner calmness. Everybody wanted a piece of Nelson Mandela. Actually had to kind of play linebacker so he didn't get overwhelmed by people wanting to touch him. But he had perfect calmness, and that struck me as this is a man who could come out of 35 years of prison and not want to seek revenge, and that was his greatness.
Wonderful. How about Fidel Castro?
Yes, Fidel came just months after he came to power, after he overthrew the Batista regime. And it was a time when nobody knew exactly where he was going. He came to the United States to assure people that he was a wonderful guy. Don't worry about me. And he gave a speech at the club and even said nice things about freedom of the press. Said he had no interest in relationships with the Soviet Union. Don't worry about me. Of course, at the almost the same time, his brother was negotiating with the Soviets to make sure that they would send troops in as advisors, military advisors, and started the relationship with the Soviet Union. So like I say, it was the day Fidel Castro played the club.
Now, a name that may not be familiar to the general public, but one that is hugely important in the history of the National Press Club, Vivian Wahlberg.
Yes. Vivian was a reporter for the newspaper in Oklahoma City, the Oklahoman. She came into the club. She came to Washington just at the time the club was admitting women. So she became part of the young women members, and she was encouraged to come in and have a leadership position, although she said that it took a long time for the men to really accept her ideas. But she worked her way up, and she became the first woman president of the National Press Club in 1982. And President Ronald Reagan swore her in, and it's a very funny speech that he gave. He acted like a country minister doing a wedding between Vivian Wahlberg and the National Press Club.
Very good, very good. How about Grover from Sesame Street?
Yeah, that's from time to time the club likes to do things aimed at the younger set, or at least children in the media. And they had Gary Nell, who is the executive director of the Sesame Workshop, was the speaker, and he brought the Muppet Grover. And the president was Donna Linewand of the USA Today. And during the speech, Grover would pop up from under the table and do his shtick about being what he would come up with different dresses on and say, "What are you doing? Isn't this the National Dress Club?" What Donna Linewand said two things. One is it's very hard to play it straight when you have somebody underneath the table bumping into your feet as pops the puppet up and Muppet up and down. The other thing is, whatever you do, never call Grover Elmo. If you call Grover Elmo, made that mistake, and Grover said, "I think this is over," and went back under the table and refused to come out. there was a lot of animosity between Grover and Elmo.
Apparently so. I think maybe we're making news with this interview. With that. Someone who's very near and dear to both of us and to generations of journalists, Marvin Calve. Talk about Marvin.
Well, Marvin, as you were well aware, in my presidency, you brought Marvin to me with the idea of putting on a regular program at the press club, which was something near and dear to me. When I ran for president, I said we should produce a regular program at the club on press criticism or about the media. The problem was I had no idea how to do that. And I had no idea where I'd get the money. And there you showed up with Marvin Calve and the backing of George Washington University. And we were able to put on the Cowboy Report, which has lasted now for 26 years. We've had 100 programs. We have brought in some of the great journalists of that whole era. And we kind of we're sitting there watching the change in the news media as it was happening. And this has been a great thing for the club. And so we've had people, as you know, like Walter Cronkite, and you can go through many of the names, Ted Koppel, and
I would say probably the high point was the joint appearance of Justices Scalia and Ginsburg.
Oh, yes.
About the First Amendment. When
they talked about the First Amendment, that was huge. That was just huge. And to have those two together, very few people knew that they, even though they were at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum, that they were great friends.
Right. And we were also very proud to reunite Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein.
That's right.
Which turned out to be the night before the death of Ben Bradlee.
That's right.
And I recall that Carl Bernstein had come down from New York, and Bob Woodward, of course, is based in Washington. And instead of going back to New York, Carl Bernstein spent the night at Bob Woodward's home so they could be together the next day when we all learned of the passing of Ben Bradlee. It was a very poignant moment and a proud moment for the press club that we were able to bring these two iconic investigative journalists back together at that particular moment in time. And then, of course, we were also very proud to bring together the executive editors of the New York Times, Dean Bacall, and of the Washington Post, Marty Baron, to talk about freedom of the press in current administration and how journalists are handling the current climate in not just in Washington, but around the country and around the world. So.
That's right. And which brings us up to the current day when we gave them both the club's coveted Fourth Estate Award for a Lifetime Achievement Award, and how Marty Baron laid out the absolute essential need of the journalism to uphold the idea that there is truth. And if we accept the fact that truth is all relative, then we have lost everything. And that's kind of near the end of the book. I thought it was extraordinarily important that that be said at this time.
And of course, Marvin's very important in the club's history. He too was a recipient of the Fourth Estate Award in 2006, and unbeknownst to perhaps a lot of the younger members of the club and to perhaps some of the listeners and viewers watching this program, Marvin Calve was the last correspondent personally hired at CBS News by Edward R. Murrow. So he is the last protege of Murrow, and we've been most fortunate to have him as part of the National Press Club front and center for the last 26 years. And that's been a joy to be involved with and a part of the proud part of the club's history. So we come to our final question. 112 years of history, host to world leaders, the place where news happens, and the world's leading professional organization for journalists. Gil, why does the National Press Club matter?
Well, Mike, it's kind of, because of its long history, it is kind of the center of journalism in Washington. It is the one place where news makers and news gatherers know they can meet. And for that, it has played such a huge role in journalism. And it now is doing so much more to push for the protection of journalists around the world, and the notion that of freedom of the press at home and abroad. And all of these things make it, I think, more essential now than ever as a place that that the country should be looking to in order to understand why journalism and is such a big part of why a free press is such a big part of maintaining a real democracy, even if Thomas Jefferson got pissed off. If you don't have open criticism of your leaders, then they can do whatever they want. And that is the first step towards tyranny. So that's why I think the free press and the National Press Club are so important.
The founding fathers of the Press Club, as you pointed out during this conversation, and as you point out in the book, had a very different purpose for creating this organization. But I suspect, as journalists, they'd be very proud of the trajectory and the current position of the club. What do you think?
I'm sure that is true. And even in the founding document, it does mention that that's one of its roles, is the protection of the First Amendment. So while we needed a place where we can play cards at midnight, this was part of what it was all about, even in 1908.
You can still play cards at the Press Club.
Not as easily, since they turned the card room into something else, into a meeting room.
The book is entitled Tales from the National Press Club. The author is noted journalist and former National Press Club president Gil Klein, now director of the University of Oklahoma's Washington Bureau.
Thank you very much, Mike. I appreciate all your time here.
The book is available on Amazon and through the publisher, History Press. Gil, it really has been a pleasure to talk with you. We look forward to creating new history in the coming months and years at the National Press Club for the next volume.
That's right. And that's one of the frustrations, is that the history kept being made even after I'd sent it to the publisher.
Gil, as a tangible token of our appreciation, we have for you one of our renowned National Press Club coffee mugs, which, as you know, have also been given to many of the people about whom you have written.
That's right. And there is a part of the book that says, "Why a mug?" And that's very funny.
Our thanks also to our wonderful National Press Club production team that made this program possible. I'm Mike Freedman, and we say to all, stay well, stay safe, and have a good day.